develop an operational approach that will ensure 100% of maritime cargo is screened as mandated by Congress, to effectively communicate operational changes to stakeholders, and to efficiently roll out and implement a new screening coordination system. In accomplishing this goal, we had a few assumptions. First, that foreign ports will accommodate shipping companies who wish to install screening facilities at foreign ports. And second, that OTS has the authority to mandate the inclusion of additional security measures within containers bound for the United States.
As we considered different ways of approaching our task, one of the most important things we wanted to keep in mind was the interests of our stakeholders. In conjunction with the interests of Congress and the general public for keeping America safe, we identified 5 particular stakeholder segments. First, we identified OTS. We had Customs and Border Security, the Coast Guard, the Maritime Administration, and freight and shipping companies. Ultimately, it was with their interests in mind that we proposed the following solution.
To meet the 100% screening requirement, we took the basic model of that we will split the burden of screening between U.S. and foreign ports. As you see, we kind of have 2 tracks where we have a foreign screening fast track and then a no foreign screening track. In the foreign screening track, what happens is the initial scans are done at foreign ports. While the cargo is in transit, we do intelligence analysis, and then those containers have a fast track exit into the United States. On the other hand, if the containers aren't screened in advance, we still do some intelligence analysis in process by looking at manifest and other data that's transmitted already by law, and then they undergo the same screening process that would have been done at foreign ports. So ultimately, it's the same process where you are just dividing the burden to maximize efficiency.
Several years ago, the prospect of 100% scanning of all containers entering the U.S. was considered impossible. But there's been several technological advancements over the past few years that have allowed this to become a reality. The first of which is drive-through X-ray scanners. These X-ray scanners are capable of processing high volumes of containers per hour while providing a high-quality, high-definition image of the contents of the container. These images, these X-ray scanners also include software to analyze these images for any anomalies that could potentially be hazardous materials within the container. These same arches where the X-ray scanners are located also include radiological sensors, so it's all one unit that the container passes through. The next innovation that will allow for enhanced container security is in-container sensors. Think of these as kind of like a smoke detector. They run on AA batteries, you stick them inside the container, and they contain an array of microsensors that are capable of detecting nuclear, radioactive, biological, and other hazardous materials, as well as ensuring that the container is not opened in transit. These scanners have broadcast a wireless signal so that a ship or a buoy alongside the cargo ship can pick up the signal and read the contents of the container without ever getting on board the ship.
Okay, so as mentioned earlier, our process calls for shipping companies to conduct most of the screening at foreign ports if they're participating in our fast track programs. So the foreign screening process includes a primary scan, including a full electronic scan that Sam just mentioned, which includes an X-ray machine as well as the radiological component, which is part of the same arch. The scanner arches are also integrated with an automatic software system that is linked in real time to our OTS command center in Virginia or somewhere else in the United States, so that if there's an immediate radiological or other anomaly detected, it can immediately bring an OTS agent online to check the X-ray image produced with the manifest and identify any potential false alarms, or call for additional screening if it's warranted. Additional screening will be conducted on-site at the foreign port as well, and this is one of our major time-saving benefits of our model, as currently the secondary scans are the most time-consuming and bottleneck-causing portion of the scanning process. In addition, our automated system will reduce the number of secondary scans required, and all these taken together provide a big business incentive to participate in the program, as it expedites the shipping process into the United States, increases ship security for the shipping companies, and in conjunction with the ship security, they should be able to get lower insurance premiums for those ships.
Now, as we've seen in recent news events, Sometimes even our most advanced scanners don't catch everything, for instance, printer box. That's why one of the most important aspects of the OTS is for them to communicate with other foreign agencies to identify any possible security threats and analyze them in conjunction with the manifest that will be provided. This is something that we can conduct across the entire shipping industry, whether they're on the fast track or not. But furthermore, for those companies that are on the fast track, OTS will actually be able to review the X-ray images from those initial scans while the ships are in transit. We view this part of our model as a very thorough aspect, something that's adding a lot of effectiveness to it, but it also might take some time. So it makes sense that the most time-consuming aspect of our model should be in conjunction with the most time-consuming part of the shipping process itself, which is while the ships are at sea. At this point, there's two other things we want to consider. For those ships that are on the fast track, we want to make sure that they remain secure throughout the entire process. Furthermore, for those ships that are not on the fast track, we want to make sure that we have some measure of protection for our home ports against possible hazards. The best solution we found for this is to have the in-container sensors on all the containers coming in. This solves both problems as it detects any possible hazards in the containers and also detects any changes that might take place. So what we're going to do is require that all containers across the board have these sensors inside. Furthermore, we're going to collect the data from these sensors a few miles out to sea with buoys so that we have a little bit of time before these ships come into our port to make sure that everything is looking all right and to identify what needs to go through secondary screening.
Finally, once the containers have arrived at U.S. ports, they'll either go through the fast track process or the full screening process. If they're in the fast track and we haven't identified any security threats through our intelligence analysis and the sensors haven't indicated anything out of the ordinary, they can actually go straight through the U.S. without any additional screening. For the containers that haven't been screened yet, they'll undergo the same screening process that was done in foreign ports. We have the first layer of security as the in-container sensors offshore to prevent, say, an attack at the port, but then they will also be fully screened, primary and secondary, at the U.S. port.
Okay, and just to review our model that we've just explained, containers start in foreign ports. If the shipping companies are on our fast track model, those containers are scanned. Copies of those scans along with manifest information are sent along to OTS agents in the U.S. for analysis en route. And if there's no primary scan, then just the manifest is sent as is currently done. The next step en route, we have intelligence analysts. They combine intelligence reports from all agencies across the board, international agencies as well, with the manifest and scan information, and to look for any potential security threats that would warrant a container being further inspected once it reaches the U.S. ports. Once they enter U.S. waters, past the buoy, we download the information from the in-container sensors, and we can identify any threats there and stop a ship with a potential threat before it enters, becomes closer to the U.S. port. Once they get to the U.S. port, if they're on the fast track, then we already have the images. As long as there was no problems from the intelligence analysis en route, they are free to leave the port. If no images were provided ahead of time, then they run through the same primary and secondary scanning process that occurred in foreign ports. And if they clear both of those, then they are free to leave the port.
Okay, so we designed a brief implementation model of how we're going to get from where we are today to where we need to be in order to have a fully operational model. So in phase one, we're going to contract with shipping companies, and we're going to talk to the shipping companies and identify, kind of gauge their interest in the program to estimate in phase two how many resources we need to purchase and implement for our own boats. Also in phase one, we're going to notify the private industries of in-container sensor deadlines and requirements in order to give the private sector enough time to adapt. We imagine phase one will take up to around 6 months to implement. After 6 months, we assume that we will have at least a good idea of how many companies and what volume of shipping is going to be opting into our fast track program. And the remainder, we're going to have to, for the remainder of the shipping coming into the United States, we're going to have to implement our domestic screening process. And so we're going to estimate and install resources needed at U.S. ports based on that initial gauge of support. At the same time, in phase two, we're going to standardize sensor functions and test buoy receivers and traffic flows to ensure maximum traffic flow across the buoys and limit bottlenecks. We imagine that phase two, because of the time required to bring all of the security around the United States up far will take about a year. And finally, in phase 3, we're going to review foreign port equipment and procedures to make sure that their security standards match our security standards, and at the same time implement the container security system. And we imagine that that final inspection will take about 6 months, so we should be operational within 2 years, which comes short of our deadline of 3.
Throughout this process, we also need to make sure that we effectively communicate this message to our stakeholders. Here's 2 main groups that we'll need to communicate with. First one being Customs Border Protection and the Coast Guard. This is going to be our primary enforcement and manpower behind our model. So we need to communicate with these government agencies and make sure that they have the resources and manpower needed for what we're implementing. Second, we have the industry, MARAD and the shipping companies. We need to effectively communicate with them, let them be aware of the new requirements, and then also communicate the message to them that there's increased efficiency for them. So we need to try to almost sell our idea to the shipping companies and explain that it's a win-win situation.
As we were developing this model, we considered a few alternatives. First, we considered not having the fast track program at all and just implementing the scanners at the U.S. ports. This, however, might cause a lot of bottlenecks, it would be expensive, and there would be no port protection for our own ports. Second, we considered putting inspectors on board the ships during the transit process, which would increase efficiency of time as they'd be inspecting while the ships are in transit, but at the same time it would be particularly expensive and require significant manpower. Finally, we considered just meeting the bare minimum of the 100% scanning requirement, but ultimately, as with the other alternatives, the shortfalls of this are just too great. So because of these shortfalls, we decided against all of these alternative approaches.
And just in conclusion, as we looked at all the alternatives and all the options and models before us, we realized that ours provides the maximum efficiency and maximum security across the U.S. container industry, and it meets the requirement of 100% screening as mandated by Congress, as well as meeting all the needs of our stakeholders. Thank you very much for your time today, and we'll now take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Terrific. Can you give me just a little bit more sort of detail on how you're going to get to 100% compliance on the, particularly on the in-container sensors, and how do you propose to get everybody to comply with those, with that requirement?
With the in-container sensors, as I mentioned, they're fairly inexpensive to produce, and they're fairly small, and we see it as kind of like a requirement that you have to have this to get into the port. It's like when you go to an airport, you have to carry an ID. And I didn't mention this in the slide, but in more detail, these in-container sensors also are embedded with memory chip that has all the manifest information for the container on board. So it's kind of like an ID for a container ship. So it's, as they enter their port, this says, okay, we know this container and this ID matches with what we have on our manifest and what we've received. So it's just kind of like requiring someone to carry an ID. When you go buy an ID, when you get an ID from the DMV, you have to pay a fee for that. So we'll see it in that.
And just to add to that, in one of our assumptions earlier, we know we were not allowed to mandate foreign screening. However, we assumed that we could mandate, once the shipping containers arrive in those waters, that they have to have this electronic security in order to proceed.
So you can mandate entry parameters,
Right,
not exit.
Exactly.
So this is a cost-related question. I'm kind of curious as what would the cost per track for a foreign screen and the cost for non-foreign screens? And so two-part question. The second part, also, you had a 3-phase process. What was the timeline to execute each of the phases?
Okay, so
Sure.
yeah, I'll just go back to our implementation model so you have it here. The timeline that we initially thought of for this timeline was 6 months for phase 1, a year for phase 2, and 6 months for phase 3. For phase 1, the contracting, we need to have enough time for companies to kind of analyze the program and see if it's in their best interest, and we believe it is. It's also time for us to market it to them. After 6 months, we thought we'd have a good enough gauge of how many shipping companies were going to participate in the program in order to proceed with phase 2, which involves us purchasing rest of the resources required in implementing those ports. The 1 year for phase 2 is because that we see that it will be the bulk. We're going to have to purchase and install a lot of security systems to bring current processes of US ports up to par, and so we figured that might take a little bit longer than the initial consulting businesses. And finally, phase 3 is another 6 months in order for us to send our inspectors to the foreign ports that we assume are already installed by the shipping companies, just to make sure that they are at the same level that we require. In terms of the costs,
I actually have some numbers on the costs, and these numbers come from a study done by Wharton Business School analyzing the costs of different methods of container security. Under the current method, where you have about 6 to 7% of all containers are scanned using what we describe as kind of a secondary method, it's a very intensive method. That costs you about $100 per container that you scan. And so on an average month, maybe about 800 out of the 100,000 containers that you scan require secondary screening. Under the new model, where you scan everything through a primary scanner, that costs about $1 to $2 per container to do. Any container from that you identify as needing secondary scanning costs about an additional $13 to $14 per container going through secondary scan. The benefit of our model is that the primary scan limits the need for those expensive, time-consuming secondary scans. In terms of cost and who's paying for what, the benefit with the foreign model is that the benefit for OTS is that the investment in terms of the scanning equipment is paid for by foreign shipping companies, and we feel they would be willing to make this investment based on the incentives they receive and the efficiency benefits. And any scanners we need to buy would be purchased on our end, but are a part of maintaining the 100% screening requirement, and are going to have to be purchased by someone at some point in the process.
So on the screening requirement, I understand that the goal is to get more of the cargo screened before it hits the hits the shores, and although that wasn't would go through secondary screening here. So in this model, is it fair to say that you'll still have a fair amount of cargo arriving in the US that has yet to be screened, that has to go through secondary screening here? And what sort of risk does that pose to the US?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you're right. The goal is to get as many on the fast track as possible, and we can't mandate it, so we got the incentives aligned. Hopefully that'll work. But you're right. Some of them aren't going to go that route, and that's why we felt it was imperative to have the in-container sensors as a secondary measure to make sure that, because it'll detect hazardous materials and any changes to the containers, it'll have at least some measure of protection from those ships. If I'm understanding your question. Okay.
Potential explosive that's trying to get into the port. I remember some of the risks assigned in the case were sinking a ship in the port or a nuclear attack on a port. I mean, that would still be a devastating attack, and so the in-container system really gives us an early warning of, it essentially tells us whether or not the container is safe to bring into the port for further treatment.
Any amount of explosive large enough to cause damage in a port would be detectable by the current level of micro sensors.
What sort of incentives do you think could be brought to bear to get people onto the fast track?
Well,
how would you go about working with various stakeholder groups to show those incentives?
Well, one incentive why we think we can get the shipping companies on board. First of all, the scans at foreign ports are going to be done in a way that's not going to significantly, or if at all, increase the time to get to ship, because stacks can sit before being loaded for up to 24 hours before there's just downtime. So if we can scan them, before that process, then we're not going to have that. I mean, we're not adding any time. If they come to the U.S. and when they're sitting in line waiting to get scanned, that can create bottlenecks. So their efficiency is that they do it when they're already having downtime. They come to the U.S. and we still have the right to pull some for secondary inspection. But if there's nothing unusual, they're just going to go straight through. And then for that's one incentive, and then another incentive that we talked about briefly is it's also in their interest to have more secure ships. They can less risky ship is going to pay lower insurance premiums. There's one study that we looked at that it's not quantified, but they will pay lower insurance premiums.
I'd just like to add that we're really one of the other hidden benefits of this program. So we're really giving the shipping companies a little bit of our intelligence analysis. I mean, we're obviously not sharing information with them, but they're benefiting from the intelligence analysis that we do through OTS. So not only are they putting their containers through an initial X-ray and radiological scan to make sure there's nothing dangerous on their ship, they're also benefiting from an OTS agent saying, you know, yes, we don't have any information that would tell us if this is a dangerous ship.
And I think you also asked about stakeholders in particular and getting them on board with the fast track program. I think considering all of this, the effectiveness of the model, a lot of the stakeholders would be interested in it for that reason, and also just because it's more efficient. We imagine that they would be on board with that process because of those reasons as well.
I have just another question. I understand there was some information related that there's one carrier that's being used to carry cargo for 100 different companies. How did that factor into your analysis?
Well, because of the in-container sensors, as I said, they wirelessly can broadcast information on the ship's manifest, sender information, company information, and things like that. So as they are offloaded, that information can be read by the person on the crane, and they can direct, if it's been by one of our pre-screened companies, that container can be sent for exit, and if it's not listed as one of our companies on the fast track, then it will be just diverted to the inspection.
And were you asking also about the ships or the companies for the
I guess
sensors?
it's more related to were there any economies of scale that were actually explored as a result of that information?
Oh. Well, I don't think we actually did not analyze the possibility of economies of scale. Obviously, you know, we assumed that the foreign port screening, there might be some cooperation because it's a private sector initiative. We were assuming that we would give the private sector